Welcome to this introductory discussion of leadership theory, an introduction to the system of leadership. This forms really the foundational context of the way we like to look at leadership in our doctoral program here at Western Kentucky University. And so the study of leadership really has a long and interdisciplinary history, and this is an interdisciplinary program. And so we try to embrace the study of leadership from the context of all these different disciplines, from the humanities to the social sciences, looking back, but also looking forward to our present context in the way leadership is taught. And so the early study of leadership, many date to this gentleman on the left, and that's Niccolo Machiavelli, who is a 16th century Florentine Italian who wrote the manual that became the instruction manual for leaders, kings, and others in the period of the Renaissance and the early modern period, called the Prince. But many also date the study of leadership back to Plato. Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum both emphasized preparing people to be effective leaders in their civilization, in their society. In the ancient Greek context, they trained people to lead in the early democracy that was being created in ancient Athens. But the study of leadership doesn't really become a discipline as such until the 19th and early 20th century. It really was first left to the historians. The historian in the 1840s, Thomas Carlyle, an English historian, advances something called the great man theory. And the name itself gives you a little bit of a glimpse as to what they thought about leadership in these early studies of leadership. It was, first of all, about men who had to be great. They are born and not made. There are intrinsic traits that define someone destined to be a leader: intelligence, sociability, competence, charisma. And so early study of leadership was about historical, biographical analysis of people who were in leadership: kings, monarchs, people who were great leaders in the military, who led battles and changed civilization from the top down. This trait approach really becomes the basis of the early study of leadership in the 19th century, in this more systematic analysis of leaders and dissecting what their abilities were, what their personal traits were, what their motivators were. And so this trait theory begins to slowly evolve in the sense that, could people learn some of this stuff? Could you develop people by really harnessing these traits to make a leader? In the late 19th century into the early 20th century, you have increasing industrialization. You also have a lot of social science fields like psychology and sociology becoming to be more dominant. And so in the fields of psychology and sociology, you begin to see a more behavioral approach and a more motivational approach that begins to influence the study of leadership. And so this notion from the Blake Moulton managerial grid, this idea of focusing on people and how you motivate people, but also focusing on results. Once again, it's still very leader-centric. It's still very much about what the leader does. So there are some elements of trait theory here, but there's a little bit of a concern for other people that you're managing. But it's really more of a management theory. And that really is what begins to predominate into the early 20th century. As we look at the evolution of leadership, you begin to see the introduction of context, the introduction of what is the situational influence? What are the situational influences that, leaders are dependent upon situations in environmental context, historical, economic, political, other contextual forces that have huge consequences. And you begin to see this played out in theories like theory Y, theory X and theory Y from McGregor. You also see it in the situational leadership approaches that become more dominant. And again, you see that same sort of XY grid of high relationship or collaboration, low relationship or more authoritative on one axis, and the other axis is focused on tasks, empowering, but also controlling, low and high task-oriented behavior. Here's another example of the same kind of grid and influence in behavioral, situational type of leadership, this from Blanchard and Hershey. Again, it's the XY axis is very relational, task-driven, also very leader-driven, as is contingency. You begin to see contingency theory that really begins now for the first time to blend together this idea of the leader, the follower, and the situation. And so that leadership is really contingent upon these variables and how these variables interact together. The leader is still very much in the center, but you're starting to see the balance between the leader, the situation, and the follower become more and more predominant. Fielder's contingency model is probably the most well-known of the mid-20th century models. And again, it's very reliant upon the task relationship aspects of the leader, but also you begin to see the influx of leader-member relations and the situational variables. So it's an attempt at really blending together those three variables. By the late 19th century, getting into the 1970s through the 1990s, you have several theorists that begin to dominate. James McGregor Burns, a political scientist, becomes one of the real leaders in the field of leadership studies. Burns's idea is that leadership is a process. It's not about the person, it's about the process. And so you begin to see this continuum that we've looked at, starting with trait theory, moving to the behaviorist, the contingency models, moving a little bit further away from the I of the leader to more of the collectivist we of the group. Burns's theory of transformational leadership really is one of those groundbreaking theories in looking at how the leader relates to his followers or her followers in the context of the situations around the goal. And so this whole process-driven leadership that really begins to predominate with transformational leadership. This idea is really popularized by Kouzes and Posner and a lot of their really intensive study of different leaders and what were the characteristics of those leaders that were transformational leaders. And Kouzes and Posner found 5 that became the basis of their work. And so it really ultimately lands with this concept of this model, this 5-component model of leadership that is one of the basis of our understanding of leadership and one of the theoretical constructs that we use in our program. And that's the definition where leadership is a process, where leaders and followers have a relationship, work together toward a goal in a context. And so it's this leader, follower, goal context that forms the basis of this process, but wrapped around it is culture and ethics, the norms, the values, the culture, the ethics of your circumstance. And those are ever changing in our global world, as we'll see. And so as you get into the 90s, Joseph Rost really begins to focus a little more on the goal aspect of leadership and this leadership moment, a time when in the leadership process, a leader and follower struggle to work together or in competition in some cases to define a goal. And it's really the goal element of this leadership continuum that you begin to see the idea of ethics really start to become an increasingly important aspect of understanding leadership theory. mainly because the goal focus of on leadership really looks at the power end of things. What's a leader willing to do to accomplish something versus the utility emphasis of what's the cost benefit calculus in doing this versus what's the right thing to do. And so understanding the ethical constructs of goal setting becomes really more and more important. And so the end of the 20th century, you begin to see a more leader follower centric, fluid study of leadership, really centered around this more facilitative focus, paying a lot more attention to followers and a lot less attention to the more directive leadership approaches in the early 20th century. And so the work of Barbara Kellerman is very instructive here, as well as the work of Robert Kelly. Both of them really pioneered work around looking at followership and this notion that it's not just about leadership, it's about understanding this larger process. And it's also about understanding this notion that in the context of our present situation, leaders and followers may not always share the same values, norms in this relationship. And so you really begin to draw further attention to the ethical dimension, that leaders really can't be devoid of values or can't be value neutral. A lot of this really came about in the post-World War II period, when they began to go back and analyze how people could follow somebody like Hitler or Stalin. And was Hitler really a leader? And so it's an area of focus of followership and an area to understand why followership and understanding followership is as important as understanding the traits and behaviors of a leader. And so you begin to see in the followership continuum, again, that same XY axis, this relational orientation versus the task orientation, but also looking more from a leader-centric to a follower-centric. And so most leadership that you begin to see in the late period of the 20th and into the early 21st century is this focus on participative leadership and transformational leadership, leaders that understand how to navigate their followers through changes and transform them. And so it's really taking a followership perspective to a lot of the work of James McGregor Burns and this whole process piece of leadership. And so really into our present time period, if you look at the leadership literature from the 90s to the present, the emphasis is more on cultural values, norms, and the ethics. But it's really this comparative leadership based on globalization. So, this notion of a more inclusive, the socio-political movements of the civil rights, the gay, lesbian, disability rights, anti-colonialism from Gandhi to Mandela, and this idea that really power transfers and influence transfers from the top to the middle and down. And it's political, but it's also organizational, where there's gaps between people have narrowed. And some of this happens because of revolutionary changes in technology and revolutionary changes in communication. You have instant access to information, but you also, through social media and this do-it-yourself era, you have the ability to express and connect. And for ordinary people, there's no longer difficulty connecting. They can do it instantly. And so people without power and authority can connect without interference to those with power. And so this becomes more of a global phenomenon than ever before. Leadership and followership are more intertwined now than ever in our global context. And that's really where the study of leadership is today. It's the leader-follower interrelationship, the process of leadership, the system of leadership in a global context in our current 21st century world.